Hong, July 2019. When does government peacekeeping turn into violence? And at what cost? What kind of liberties might we take for granted in democratic societies today? And can we expect a fair and unbiased treatment from governments, including a transparent approach to the preservation of historical records? Hi, you're listening to Days of Archives, and today we'll be working with some incredible historical documents from the Queensland State Archives to examine how official government correspondence records tell the story of the Hughenden Beer Strike of 1918 to 1920, and to what extent have protests been historically effective in achieving positive outcomes for workers and citizens of our Sunshine State and beyond. In 1918, the Queensland town of Hughenden was in turmoil. Around the world, in the aftermath of World War I and the subsequent breakdown of class structures, common people were discovering their strength in numbers and beginning to understand that they had a right to shape the kind of society they wanted to live in. 25 female hotel workers in the town of Hughenden were seeking a weekly half-day off, as stipulated by recent changes in their award. That July, the Australian Workers' Union found that 7 out of the 8 hotels in Hughenden were not giving the girls, who work between 10 and 16 hours per day, 7 days a week, an afternoon off. The AWU demanded that the hotels back pay the women from December 1917, a total back pay of 7 months, amounting to £2 each, or $624.90, a significant amount by even today's hospitality standards. Even though the hotel employers eventually agreed to recognize the half-holiday, technical legalities meant that they were not obligated to back pay their staff. So unionists went ahead and blacklisted the 7 hotels who used the loophole as an excuse. This was the beginning of the beer strike. Over the next 3 months, black hotels were boycotted by unionists and sympathizers, while only 2 other hotels were declared to be serving white beer. But it would all come to a head between Wednesday, October the 16th and Saturday, October the 19th, when the open-air meetings organized by the unionists was broken up and violence took hold of the streets. A group of anti-strike civilians made an organized effort to assault beer strike speakers over the course of 3 nights. It was reported that police initially just stood by and didn't break up the fight, that they wanted the strikers attacked. Other reports tell of how pro-strike civilians were bullied and intimidated by police into not giving official statements.
And you can actually hear the scuffle and the brawl and the fight.
Cynthia Cochrane is an archivist at the Queensland State Archives. We talked about the different recounts of the beer strike assaults, as described in the letters filed under Series 5263, General Correspondence of the Home Secretary's Office. Cynthia recognizes that the violence of the anti-strikers comes through in multiple accounts in the series.
The value is that we are reading accounts made in the moment, and there are different points of view. There are points of view of the police, there's points of view of strikers being brutalized. It's very clear that some anti-strike members of the public were extremely brutal. That comes across very vividly. And one also has a sense of the fears of the strikers. They're terribly afraid. One wonders why they were afraid to go back to the police and make statements. One wonders why they were afraid to go to hospital.
But Cynthia is also a strong advocate of transparency in record keeping, particularly in grey areas of history.
So often in history, the fascinating topics are the ones where there's ethically sort of not a black and white boundary. There's lack of understanding, lack of research, and in having conversations around what could this have meant at the time to the different parties, in having those conversations, we're talking about ethics, and it throws light on our ethical discussions of today. Grey areas are fascinating. We're drawn to them as human beings. And
the correspondence in the State Archives is only a small part of the beer strike story. Cynthia stresses that primary sources help us understand historical perspectives in a much more authentic way.
So the series was the general correspondence in the Home Secretary's office, where they had some police records. And that once you'd understood the context, which is what the series description in our catalogue gives you, you might have said, aha, there will be more police records here at the State Archives. So there's more primary material for me to look at so that I can really understand the police perspective, because maybe the police was standing in the middle of the strikers and the anti-strikers. Maybe the police might be giving us, or maybe not. In Queensland, State Archives is separate from private archives.
While the beer strikers were believers in democratic values like freedom of assembly and speech and fair pay, Cynthia is also invested in her own fight for democracy. By maintaining transparent, accessible records of our past, present and future, Queensland State Archives is able to tell stories fairly, with audiences constructing their own points of view from impartial materials.
As archivists, we are objective collectors. We don't pick and choose, and I believe that ultimately that is serving our democracy, so that we have very diverse perspectives, very diverse professional approaches.
But how about the record keeping of non-democracies today, and their fight for human rights freedoms we often take for granted? The recent street demonstrations in Hong Kong show the power of protesters in the face of an opaque and violent Chinese state and police. Drew Pavlo is a third-year undergraduate student at the University of Queensland.
So the protests I organised pro-Hong Kong, criticising our university's links with the Chinese state while the human rights abuses were being perpetrated in Hong Kong and Xinjiang in July, that protest, that was probably the first one I'd ever organised. I think I've really found like a vocation, something I really want to dedicate my entire life to, like human rights activism. And yeah, that's something I'm really passionate about and want to commit myself to.
Now an elected UQ senator, Drew understands the relevance of protesting in the face of a violent opponent.
We were attacked. If we hadn't been attacked and if people hadn't responded to our like attempt to stand up for Hong Kong in such a thuggish way, we probably would have just like ended the protest, gone off, gotten boost juice and Subway, gone about our semester like a normal semester. Nothing would have happened. No one would ever remember it. And then suddenly, because they attacked us on that day, it added just so much fuel to the fire and added so much oxygen to the cause, and to some extent provoking bullies and thugs into like exposing themselves for what they are. It's a very viable tactic when fighting for human rights and democracy and civil rights. Yeah.
Like Cynthia, Drew actively advocates for organizational transparency as a way of safeguarding his and other students' freedom of speech, against who he describes as pro-communist campus thugs. He says he couldn't stay silent in the face of bullies anymore, and for that, Twitter helped him.
It's an amazing platform for just getting the truth out there. I've been able to post about the assaults I faced, the death threats I faced. I was able to expose how the university sort of like bullied me and tried to like threaten my enrollment as a student here. I also was able to expose someone high up in the university administration, like top 10 of the university, like leaked to me information that in the days after the July 24 protest I led at UQ about the Confucius Institute, there was a cyber attack originating from mainland China that took down UQ's internet for half an hour, and the university estimates that it would have cost about $10 million in equipment to carry out this type of cyber attack. So it was a very sophisticated operation, probably from a state-based actor.
In a non-democratic environment, both Cynthia and Drew agreed that there are many downsides for the people when it comes to government transparency in communications, record keeping, and media control.
They compare them to ISIS fighters and stuff like that. It seems sadly that like the Chinese state's attempt to shape the narrative is pretty successful among like Chinese mainland audiences. Sadly, it shows, I think, just how effective digital dictatorship is. It's probably going to be a huge force against democracy and human rights in this century.
From Hughenden to Hong Kong, on university campuses, hotel backrooms, and in the streets, people rise up to defend their right to live in a fair society.
Ultimately, power at just the barrel of the gun isn't enough. Like, you have to have something more legitimate to underpin your power in politics.
Even though most of the Hughenden girls were never backpaid, Cynthia draws our attention to how the documents we look through together represent a cementing chapter in the history of Queensland workers' rights. The way in which we archive our collective past influences how we think and reflect today. So when we are given the chance to interpret history objectively, we are being treated fairly, whether we know it or not. And that is democracy.
There's always a slow-moving trend towards tyranny, and unless citizens are fighting against that, we'll eventually wake up one day and we'll realise all our rights and civil liberties have been eroded and evaporated. Yeah.
A special thanks to our guests Cynthia Cochrane and Drew Pavlou. Days of Archives was produced by Alice Nichols, Alice Rosende and Timothy Lau in the University of Queensland, Brisbane, Australia.